The first thing my sister said to her daughter after disappearing for 8 years was not hello. She pointed across the adoption courtroom at me and said, "Tell her she's only your aunt." Sadie was 10. She had been 2 when Kendra left her on my porch with a diaper bag, a stuffed rabbit, and a promise that she would be back in 6 weeks. For 8 years, I had handled every fever, every nightmare, every parent conference, and every costume change before a school play. I had signed every medical form I was legally allowed to sign, and fought for permission on the ones I was not. But in that courtroom, one sentence turned all of it into something temporary. Sadie looked at Kendra, then at me. Her hands began to shake so hard that the zipper on her cardigan clicked against the wooden bench. Judge Brooks leaned forward. She did not ask Sadie which one of us was her real mother. She asked, "Sadie, whom do you want sitting beside you while we continue?" Sadie did not answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a stack of folded construction paper, softened at the corners from being opened and closed too many times. There were 8 Mother's Day cards, one for every year my sister had been gone. On the top card, written in purple crayon, the word Mom had been scratched out until the paper had nearly torn through. My sister's face changed before the judge had read a single line. By the time the hearing ended, I knew Kendra had not returned to take her daughter home. She had returned for something a single word from Sadie could protect. Before I tell you what my sister was trying to protect, I hope you are doing well wherever you are listening from. Stay with me to see what happened next, and please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of Sadie's story. Sadie placed the cards on the table between us as carefully as if they might break. Judge Brooks looked at the stack, then at the 3 adults who had already tried to turn a 10-year-old's life into a question of vocabulary. "Sadie, you do not have to explain the cards right now," she said, keeping her voice low. "I only asked who you want beside you while the adults continue." Sadie lifted one trembling hand and pointed at me. She did not say my name. She did not call me Aunt Tessa, and she did not call me anything else. I moved from the chair behind our attorney to the bench beside her. Every part of me wanted to pull her against my chest, but I knew what it felt like when frightened adults used a child's body to prove a point. I placed my hand palm up between us and let Sadie decide. After a moment, she hooked 2 fingers around mine. Across the aisle, Kendra sat beside her attorney in a cream suit I had never seen before. A leather folder rested in front of her, thick with tabs and printed pages. She had not wandered into court after a sudden change of heart. She had been served at an address Jonah found through a public court record, and she had arrived prepared to fight. Her attorney stood and said, Kendra had rebuilt her life, found stable housing, and come forward to repair a relationship she deeply regretted losing. He described the last 8 years as a family arrangement that had continued longer than anyone intended. Kendra nodded at the right moments. When Judge Brooks asked whether she agreed with that description, she folded her hands and softened her voice. "I was not absent by choice," she said. "Tessa helped me during the worst period of my life. What began as temporary care became permanent because I was ashamed and because I believed Sadie was safe. I am here now because I want to make things right." I felt Sadie's fingers tighten around mine. Kendra had managed to describe 8 years without saying that she had missed every birthday, every doctor's appointment, and every first day of school. Jonah rose beside me. "Miss Calder has held legal custody since Sadie was 2. The current petition asks the court to determine whether Kendra's consent is still required after years without meaningful contact or support. This is not a final adoption ceremony today." Judge Brooks acknowledged him, but Kendra had already turned towards Sadie again. Her expression was tender, although her voice carried the sharpness I remembered from childhood, the warning hidden inside a request. "Sweetheart, tell them the truth," she said. Then she pointed at me. "Tell her you're only her aunt." Sadie's breathing changed. She stared at the polished floor and whispered, "If I say it wrong, do I have to leave with somebody?" The question struck harder than Kendra's accusation. I leaned toward Judge Brooks instead of answering Sadie myself. "Please do not make her decide which one of us is real," I said. She should not have to protect an adult with the name she uses. For the first time, Kendra's gentle expression slipped. No one is asking her to protect me. I am her mother. Judge Brooks raised one hand before the argument could grow. She examined the top card without opening the rest. Beneath the purple crayon, the paper was rough, where Sadie had tried to erase the same word too many times. The judge then lifted the newest card just enough to read the front. For the person who always comes, she read quietly. Kendra's attorney objected that the cards could not determine whether his client's consent was legally required. Judge Brooks agreed immediately. They will not, she said. What they show me today is that this child is carrying a conflict no child should be asked to resolve in open court. She kept my existing legal custody order in place. Kendra would not leave with Sadie, and she would not receive private contact simply because she had appeared after 8 years. Judge Brooks appointed Miriam Sloan as Sadie's guardian ad litem, explaining that Miriam would speak with Sadie privately, review the history, and make recommendations about her best interests. Kendra's attorney asked for time to demonstrate that a meaningful mother-daughter relationship could still be restored. He requested a delay and increasing visits. Judge Brooks allowed neither immediately. She ordered a joint intake with Miriam first, and any contact after that would occur only under a plan approved by the court. The adoption would not be finalized that day, but Kendra's arrival did not erase the custody order that had governed Sadie's life since she was 2. Sadie slowly released my fingers and folded the cards back into a careful stack. Kendra watched her, but not with the grief I expected from a mother seeing 8 missed years laid out in construction paper. Her eyes moved from the cards to the judge, then to the clerk, entering the next stage of the case into the record. When the hearing ended, I waited until Sadie had gone ahead with Jonah before gathering my bag. Kendra stepped close enough that her perfume covered the dry courtroom smell. "You have no idea what this hearing can cost me," she whispered. I looked toward Sadie, who was standing by the doors with all 8 cards pressed against her chest. Kendra did not look at her once. That was when I understood my sister was afraid of losing something, but it was not her daughter. Sadie did not speak during the drive home. She held the 8 cards against her stomach with both arms, as if the seatbelt was not enough to keep them safe. I kept my eyes on the road and resisted every question pressing against my teeth. Asking why she had hidden them would have been easy. Asking what she wanted me to understand would have been harder, because I was beginning to fear that the answer involved something I had said. At home, Sadie placed the cards on the kitchen table and went upstairs without taking off her cardigan. Halfway to the stairs, she stopped and looked back. "You can read them," she said, "just not while I'm there." I told her I would wait until she was ready, but she shook her head. "No, read them now. I just don't want to see your face." The bathroom door closed a minute later, and water began running through the pipes. I sat at the kitchen table where I had helped with multiplication homework, signed school forms, and waded through more fevers than I could count. The cards lay in front of me in order, their corners softened by years of being handled in secret. The first was made from yellow construction paper. A row of red fingerprints formed flowers along the bottom. In one corner, a teacher had written the date in neat black ink. May 2019. Sadie had been 3. Her name was a backward S, followed by several determined loops. Above it, in an adult's handwriting, were the words, "For Aunt Tessa, who takes care of me." The phrase took me back to July 2018, when Kendra had stood on my porch with Sadie on one hip and a diaper bag hanging from the other shoulder. Sadie had been 2, warm from sleep, her cheek pressed against Kendra's collarbone. A stuffed rabbit with one bent ear was trapped between them. "I need 6 weeks," Kendra had said before I invited her inside. "Maybe less. I have to straighten some things out." She gave me a temporary medical authorization, 2 changes of clothes, a bottle of children's pain reliever, and a list of foods Sadie would usually eat. Kendra's husband, Sadie's father, had died the year before. Grief had made my sister unpredictable, but not incapable of arranging paperwork when it served her. I asked where she was going. She said she did not know yet. I asked how I was supposed to reach her. She gave me a number that stopped working 9 days later. At the end of 6 weeks, I called every contact I had. Messages went unanswered. Mail returned. The address Kendra had given me belonged to a short-term rental she had already left. I did not simply decide Sadie was mine and continue as if no rules existed. I took the temporary authorization, her father's death certificate, the returned mail, and my record of every failed call to juvenile court. The emergency order came first, followed by long-term legal custody later that year. It required Kendra to keep the court informed of her address and contribute to Sadie's care. She did neither. The shower upstairs stopped. I turned to the second card. It was blue, cut into the shape of a teacup. The greeting line had been left blank. Inside, someone had prompted the children to complete the sentence, "You help me when..." Sadie had written, in uneven block letters, "I am hot and scared." That card brought back the first serious fever after the emergency custody order. Sadie had awakened crying so hard she could not tell me what hurt. Her temperature was over 104. I wrapped her in a blanket, drove to urgent care, and carried the new court order in a plastic folder because the temporary authorization had expired. The receptionist asked my relationship to the child. "I'm her aunt and legal custodian," I said. Sadie heard only the first part. While the nurse checked her pulse, she clung to my shirt and asked whether I was allowed to take her home afterward. "Yes," I told her. "You're coming home with me." She asked the same question twice more that night. When we returned after midnight, I slept on the floor beside her bed, with my hand through the rails. Sometime before dawn, she called me Mom in her sleep. The next morning, when the fever had broken, she remembered enough to look embarrassed. I kissed her forehead and said the sentence I would repeat for years. "You don't have to call me Mom." I thought I was removing a burden. I thought I was telling her she could love Kendra without betraying me. I had learned to fear forced names, long before Sadie came to me. After our mother died, our father remarried a woman named Patricia. Within weeks, Patricia corrected us every time we used her first name. "You have a mother again," she would say. "You should be grateful." Kendra adapted faster than I did. She called Patricia Mom whenever our father was in the room and used her first name when he was not. I refused for months and paid for it with silent dinners and lectures about loyalty. By the time I finally gave in, the word felt less like affection than admission. I had promised myself I would never make a child prove love with a title. What I had never considered was that refusing to claim a title could wound a child too. The cards moved through the years without needing full explanations. Green paper with a paper daisy, white cardstock stamped with crooked hearts. A card shaped like a purse, with the greeting, "For my special person." Sadie's handwriting became smaller and more controlled. The pictures changed from stick figures to scenes I recognized. The two of us at the zoo, beside a birthday cake, standing under the school marquee. The sixth card showed a stage with red curtains. On the back, Sadie had written, "You came, even when I forgot." Her first school play had been a production about farm animals. Sadie played a duck and had practiced one line for 3 weeks. On the night of the performance, she walked to the center of the stage, saw the rows of faces, and forgot every word. The teacher whispered from the wings. Sadie stood frozen until she found me in the 3rd row. I smiled and made the small, flapping motion we had practiced in the kitchen. Sadie remembered her line. Afterward, she ran past the refreshment table and launched herself into my arms. "I knew you'd still be there if I messed up," she said. I had treated that sentence as proof that she felt secure. Looking at the card now, I saw the other possibility. Perhaps she had been checking whether security could survive a mistake. The 7th card had no greeting at all. By then, Sadie was 9. That was the year she came home from a school registration appointment and placed the emergency contact form beside my coffee. "You can sign if I get hurt," she said. "You can pick me up. You can talk to my teacher. Why aren't you my mom on paper?" I told her legal custody already allowed me to care for her. She said that was not what she had asked. We spent months with a child therapist and Jonah before I filed. I did not want Sadie's fear to make the decision for her. When she continued asking after therapy had given her safer ways to speak, I filed. Finding Kendra had once seemed impossible. Serving her legally was not. Jonah found a current address attached to a public criminal court docket and arranged formal service through the proper channel. The papers told Kendra the date of the hearing. They did not summon a mother out of nowhere. They informed a woman who had spent 8 years ignoring every other notice that one final legal decision was moving forward without her. The bathroom door opened upstairs. I heard Sadie pause at the top of the stairs, listening. I picked up the 8th card. It was plain white, folded precisely down the center. There were no flowers, photographs, or classroom prompts. On the front, in blue ink, Sadie had written one word, Mom. Inside, beneath a short list of ordinary things we had done together, was a final sentence. I never gave you these, because you told me I didn't have to. I read it twice before understanding what she meant. For 8 years I had believed I was giving Sadie permission not to choose me. Sadie had heard something else entirely. She had heard that I did not want to be chosen. I found Sadie sitting halfway down the stairs after I finished reading the last card. She had changed into pajamas, but her hair was still damp from the shower. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The 8 cards remained spread across the kitchen table below us, recording a conversation we had somehow avoided for most of her life. I never meant that I didn't want to be your mother, I said. Sadie pulled one knee against her chest. Then what did you mean? I meant you didn't owe me a name. I didn't want you to think loving me meant you had to stop loving Kendra. Sadie looked toward the kitchen. I don't know her enough to know how I love her. There was no anger in her voice. That made the truth harder to hear. I sat one step below her so I would not make her look up at me. You don't have to decide that now either, I said. She rubbed her thumb against a loose thread on her sleeve. Are you still allowed to adopt me? The judge hasn't decided yet. Miriam needs to talk to all of us first. Sadie nodded as if I had given her instructions for a school project. Then she asked whether she had to bring the cards again. I told her they belonged to her, and no one would take them without explaining why. She gathered them into a stack and carried them upstairs, leaving me alone with the knowledge that my careful silence had not protected her as well as I believed. The joint intake took place 9 days later in Miriam Sloane's office. Jonah had warned me that it was not a visit, and not a test Kendra could pass in a single afternoon. Miriam wanted to observe how we spoke around Sadie, before deciding what further contact would be appropriate. Her office was inside a family services building near downtown Columbus. The room had a low table, several armchairs, and shelves filled with games, chosen for children younger than Sadie. A wooden puzzle sat beside a basket of plastic animals. Sadie examined them and whispered that the room looked like a dentist's office, designed by someone afraid of teeth. I almost laughed. Humor was how she tested whether a room still belonged to her. Kendra arrived carrying 2 shopping bags and a stack of wrapped boxes. She wore a pale blue dress and had curled her hair the way she used to for family photographs. She smiled at Sadie, with the careful warmth of someone stepping onto a stage after rehearsing alone. I brought you something for every birthday I missed, she said. There were 8 gifts, each labeled with an age. Kendra arranged them across the low table from 3 through 10, creating a bright paper timeline between herself and Sadie. Sadie stared at the packages. Do I have to open them in order? Kendra's smile tightened. I thought it might be meaningful. I was just asking because the number 7 one is making a rattling sound. Miriam invited everyone to sit before the gift opening turned into the purpose of the meeting. She explained that she was there to understand Sadie's needs and observe the adults, not to decide who had the most convincing explanation in one afternoon. Kendra placed one hand against her chest. I understand. I only want Sadie to know I never forgot her. I looked at the 8 gifts. Remembering a birthday required no wrapping paper. It required a call, a card, or an address that stayed valid long enough for a reply. Miriam asked Kendra to explain, in her own words, why she had disappeared. Kendra lowered her eyes and spoke about grief after the death of Sadie's father. She described unstable housing, depression, and the shame of knowing another woman was doing what she believed she should have been able to do herself. I kept thinking I needed to become someone Sadie could be proud of before I came back, she said. Every year that passed made returning harder. Her story contained enough truth to sound complete. She had lost her husband. She had struggled afterward. Shame could make people hide from the damage they had caused. For one dangerous moment, I imagined that she had spent 8 years wanting to return but lacking the courage. Then Miriam asked why Kendra had never contacted the court, sent support, or requested even supervised communication. Kendra looked at me. Tessa made it clear she had everything under control, she said. She has always been the capable one. Whenever I thought about reaching out, I imagined her telling me how much better Sadie was without me. I never received anything to answer, I said. I'm explaining how I felt. You're explaining what you imagined I would do. Miriam lifted one hand before our old argument could take over the room. Kendra, did Tessa ever directly tell you not to contact Sadie? Kendra paused. Not in those exact words. It was the first crack in her version, but she repaired her expression quickly. She turned toward Sadie and asked about school. I saw that you won the speaking award, she said. And I know you played the mayor in The Clockmaker's Secret. Your line about time belonging to everyone was wonderful. Sadie glanced at me. The school had posted the award, the play title, and that line on its public page after I signed the annual media release. You watched it? Sadie asked. I saw the video. The school had posted a 90-second clip. Kendra made it sound like she had sat through the entire performance. Sadie rested her elbows on her knees. What happens after that line? Kendra hesitated. I'm sure you can tell me. The clock breaks, and then I get blamed for stealing Tuesday. Kendra laughed a second too late. That sounds funny. It wasn't supposed to be. It was a serious play about municipal time fraud. Miriam hid a smile behind her pen. Sadie had invented the plot, but Kendra did not know her well enough to recognize when she was joking. The differences became clearer as the conversation continued. Kendra knew the name of Sadie's award, but not the name of her teacher. She remembered that Sadie had loved strawberries as a toddler, but did not know she had developed an allergy to a common antibiotic. She called her Sadiebug, a nickname Sadie had stopped tolerating in kindergarten. When Miriam asked what helped Sadie sleep in an unfamiliar place, Kendra said she used to need her stuffed rabbit. Sadie looked at her carefully. He's in a box, because his eye fell off. I can fix him, Kendra said. I like the hallway light now. Kendra had come prepared with memories of a 2-year-old and information anyone could find online. She had nothing from the 8 years between them. Still, I could see Sadie studying her. Curiosity lived beside caution. She wanted to know whether Kendra's laugh resembled hers, whether they held their hands the same way, and whether any part of her life before my porch could be recovered. Kendra seemed to notice that opening. She reached across the table, stopping just short of touching Sadie. You can call me Mom, she said softly. You don't have to be afraid of hurting anyone. Sadie picked up the gift labeled 7 and shook it beside her ear. This one sounds like marbles. Kendra withdrew her hand. We can open them later. Good, because if it's marbles, I'm not allowed to scatter them on the stairs anymore. Her joke changed the subject, but her shoulders had risen toward her ears. Kendra had again turned a name into a test. Miriam asked what Kendra hoped would happen over the next several months. Kendra said she wanted time to rebuild trust and restore her role as Sadie's mother. When Miriam requested practical details, Kendra returned to emotion. We need space to reconnect without a permanent adoption cutting that process off, she said. Her attorney later proposed delaying the case for 4 months. He called it a reasonable period for assessment and gradual contact. 4 months was specific enough to sound considered, but Kendra did not explain what would happen after it. She offered no school plan, no proposed home schedule, and no address where Sadie would have a room. She wanted time. She did not say what she intended to build with it. As the meeting ended, Sadie chose to leave the gifts unopened. Kendra looked disappointed, but she told Miriam she respected her daughter's pace. The sentence sounded polished enough to have been practiced. In the hallway, Sadie asked me whether joking had been rude. I told her humor was not a crime, but she should never feel she had to entertain adults to make them behave. While Jonah walked Sadie toward the elevators, Miriam asked me to remain behind. She closed the office door and folded her hands over her notebook. "You documented years of missed support, failed contact, and unanswered notices," she said. "You sought legal custody when Kendra vanished. You built an entire life around the consequences of her leaving." I waited, unsure where the question was going. Miriam studied me for a moment, before asking, "Why have you spent 8 years describing abandonment without using the word?" I opened my mouth, but no answer came. Miriam's question followed me out of her office and into the parking garage. Why had I spent 8 years describing abandonment without using the word? I told myself I had been careful for Sadie's sake. Kendra was still her mother by birth, and I did not want my anger to become the voice Sadie used when she thought about where she came from. That explanation had always sounded responsible, until Miriam asked the question plainly. By refusing to name what Kendra had done, I had left Sadie alone to decide whether leaving for 8 years was serious enough to count. Jonah called the next afternoon while I was reviewing delivery schedules at work. His voice had the measured tone he used when he had found something important, but did not want me drawing conclusions before he explained it. "Can you come to my office after work?" he asked. "This is not something I want to summarize over the phone." I arranged for Sadie to stay at rehearsal with her drama teacher for an extra hour. She was preparing for the school's summer showcase, and under normal circumstances, she would have considered additional stage time a reward. When I told her Jonah needed to speak with me, she raised one eyebrow. "Is this secret adult paperwork or boring adult paperwork?" "Probably both," she nodded. "Bring snacks when you come back." Jonah had 3 documents on his desk when I arrived. He waited until I sat down before turning the first page toward me. "Kendra has an open criminal case in Franklin County," he said. "She entered a guilty plea last month. The charge involved money taken from the property management company where she had worked. According to the public filings, Kendra had created fake vendors, approved invoices in their names, and directed payments into accounts she controlled. The amount listed was close to $180,000. I stared at the number, but the money was not what made my stomach tighten. "When is she being sentenced?" "September." The date was less than a week after the end of the 4-month delay her attorney had requested in the adoption case. Jonah watched me understand the connection. "She didn't ask for 4 months because she thought 4 months would repair 8 years, I said. "No," he replied. "I don't believe she did." He slid the second document across the desk. It was a sentencing memorandum filed by Kendra's criminal attorney. Jonah explained that the memorandum was part of the public court record. He had not accessed the presentence investigation report, which was not available to us, and he had not contacted the criminal judge. "The distinction matters," he said. "We can use what was publicly filed and obtain certified copies through the clerk. We cannot pretend we have access to sealed material." I nodded, although my attention had already dropped to the declaration attached behind the memorandum. Kendra had signed it beneath a statement, affirming that the information was true. She did not claim Sadie lived with her every day. The lie was more careful than that. She described Sadie's placement with me as a temporary family arrangement caused by grief and financial instability. She claimed she had remained emotionally essential to her daughter, maintained regular contact, and contributed whenever she was able. She also said incarceration would destroy an active process of reunification. I read the paragraph twice. There was no reunification process when she signed this. "The declaration was signed 3 days after she received the adoption papers," Jonah said. "She may be using the contested case itself to create the appearance of one." The room seemed to narrow around me. Kendra had not simply reacted to the adoption petition. She had turned her reaction into evidence for another court. I looked at Jonah. Wouldn't someone check whether she actually had custody? Eventually they might. But court systems do not automatically share every file. Your legal custody order is in juvenile court. Her criminal case is in a different division. If she told her criminal attorney that Sadie lived with you under an informal arrangement, he may have relied on what she gave him. Her attorney didn't know. I cannot know that yet. Nothing in the public filing proves he knew the full history. The memorandum was filed recently, and the prosecution has not filed its response. Kendra had counted on the distance between two courtrooms. In one, she could say I had prevented contact. In the other, she could say contact had continued. Each version made her sound injured by circumstances rather than responsible for them. Jonah turned to the third document. It was an exhibit attached to the sentencing memorandum. At the top was a photograph of Sadie on stage, in her mayor's costume, one hand raised as she delivered the line Kendra had quoted during the joint intake. I recognized the photograph immediately. The school had posted it after the winter performance. I had signed the media release form at the beginning of the year because Sadie loved seeing the cast photos on the school page. Beneath the image, Kendra had written that she closely followed Sadie's education and creative development despite their temporary separation. She took this from the school website, I said. It appears so. That doesn't prove she was involved in Sadie's life. No, the photo alone proves very little. It does show how she built the story she presented. A public photograph had allowed Kendra to stand near a moment she had never attended. She had taken Sadie's work, her costume and the pride on her face, then placed herself just outside the frame, as if she had always been there. Jonah told me he would request certified copies and determine how the filing could be presented in the adoption case. He warned me not to contact Kendra, her criminal attorney, the prosecutor, or either judge. What do I tell Sadie? I asked. Only what she needs to know. She does not need the amount, the charges, or the sentencing strategy. But if that photograph becomes part of our filing, she should not be blindsided. I collected Sadie from rehearsal an hour later. She climbed into the car holding a plastic crown and complained that the elastic had snapped for the third time. I drove 2 blocks before telling her I needed to explain something about the photograph from her last play. Her expression changed before I finished. Kendra saw it online? Yes. That's how she knew my line. Yes. Sadie turned the broken crown in her lap. Did she use it for court? I chose my words carefully. She included it in paperwork about her own situation. She used it to make it sound as if she had been involved in your life. Sadie stared through the windshield. But she wasn't there. I know. Did she say she was? She made it sound like she had been following everything closely. Sadie pressed her thumbnail into the crown's plastic rim. Can people just take pictures and make them mean something else? People can try. That doesn't make the story true. She was quiet until we reached home. Instead of getting out, she asked me to turn off the engine. I don't want the school posting pictures anymore. We can change the permission form. And I don't want to do the showcase. The answer came too quickly for me to argue without making it about my own disappointment. You love the showcase. I loved the last play too. Then she put it in a court thing. This is not your fault. I know. I just don't want to give her anything else. The sentence hurt because Sadie was no longer only afraid of choosing the wrong name. She had begun measuring what parts of herself could be safely seen. I wanted to tell her that quitting would let Kendra take the stage from her. I stopped before the words came out. Sadie had spent years hearing adults turn their needs into lessons she was expected to follow. I would not make performing another duty. You can miss rehearsal tomorrow, I said. We'll speak to your teacher and change the photo permission. You do not have to decide about the whole showcase tonight. She nodded, although relief did not reach her face. That evening, after Sadie went upstairs, I opened the certified copies request Jonah had emailed me. The legal language was dry, But the contradiction underneath it was simple. In the adoption case, Kendra claimed I had blocked her from contacting or supporting Sadie. In the criminal filing, she claimed she had maintained regular contact and continued contributing as Sadie's mother. Both stories had been signed under her name. I placed the pages beside each other on the kitchen table. For 8 years, Kendra had survived by telling a different version of herself in every room. For the first time, 2 of those rooms had opened into each other. Once Jonah obtained certified copies of Kendra's sentencing declaration, he did not immediately file them with the adoption court. He explained that knowing my sister had lied was different from proving which parts mattered to the legal question before Judge Brooks. The court still had to decide whether Kendra's consent was required, and every step had to remain focused on Sadie rather than on my anger. A week later, both sides were ordered to attend a settlement conference. The meeting took place in a small room inside the courthouse, far from the courtroom where Sadie had unfolded her cards. There was no judge behind a bench, and no audience. Only a rectangular table, a neutral conference officer, Jonah, Kendra, and the attorney representing her in the adoption case. Sadie did not attend. Miriam had recommended keeping her away from negotiations between adults, especially when any agreement might later affect the words she believed she was allowed to use. Kendra arrived without gifts. She wore a gray suit and carried the same leather folder I had seen at the first hearing. She looked at me once, then spent several minutes speaking quietly with her attorney. The conference officer began by reminding us that a settlement could not override Sadie's best interests or require anyone to make a false statement. She outlined the lawful options available. The case could proceed to a hearing. The parties could agree to a limited continuance. Kendra could participate in supervised contact and evaluation. She could also choose to consent to the adoption, either immediately or after certain conditions were completed. Kendra's attorney proposed postponing the hearing until after a series of meetings supervised by Miriam. He described the request as a chance to determine whether some form of continued relationship could be preserved. Jonah asked what Kendra intended to do during that period. Rebuild trust, her attorney said. In practical terms, Jonah replied. Kendra leaned forward. You cannot reduce a mother and daughter to a checklist. No, Jonah said. But a request for delay needs a purpose, more specific than emotion. Her attorney suggested phone calls, supervised meetings, and family counseling if Miriam recommended it. Everything he proposed was legally possible. He did not mention Kendra's criminal case, the sentencing declaration, or the date in September. I watched Kendra while the others spoke. She was not listening for a path back into Sadie's daily life. She was listening for a way to move the adoption decision beyond one particular date. When Jonah asked whether she wanted Sadie placed with her, Kendra said it was too early to discuss a transition. When he asked whether she had prepared a bedroom, she said housing questions could be addressed later. When he asked whether she was requesting shared decision-making about school or medical care, she said the process should begin with repairing emotional damage. Every answer moved away from responsibility and back toward the title she claimed had been taken from her. After nearly an hour, the conference officer called a short break. Jonah stepped into the hallway to return a phone call. Kendra's attorney remained inside, reviewing notes with the conference officer. I walked toward the water fountain near the elevators. Kendra followed me. You found the criminal case, she said. I turned. You filed it in a public court. Her eyes moved toward the conference room door. My attorney in there does not handle that case. That doesn't make the declaration true. It makes it more complicated than you understand. I waited. Kendra had always mistaken silence for an invitation to fill the room. She lowered her voice. Stop asking the court to find that I abandoned her. That is what happened. What happened is that you took over during a crisis. You left for 8 years. I left Sadie with family. You left her with an authorization that expired after 6 weeks. You did not call the court, support her, or answer notices. Kendra's jaw tightened. You want the adoption. I can give you that. The offer stopped me, not because I trusted it, but because it was the first time she had spoken as if Sadie's future were something she could trade. What do you mean? Withdraw the claim that I failed to maintain contact. Describe the arrangement for what it was. Temporary care that lasted longer than expected because my life was unstable. That is not what it was. It is close enough to the truth that no one has to be destroyed by it. I understood then why she had followed me into the hallway, away from both attorneys. Her lawyer could propose a continuance. He could not ask me to reshape 8 years, so another court would see Kendra as a mother interrupted by hardship instead of a woman who had disappeared. Kendra continued before I could answer. You keep legal custody. Sadie stays with you. Nothing changes for her. Once my sentencing is over, I sign the consent and you finish the adoption. The word sentencing sounded smaller in her mouth than the 8 years she wanted me to rename. You want me to delay the hearing and tell the court you maintained a relationship. I want you to stop making the worst period of my life the only thing anyone is allowed to know about me. You signed a declaration saying you stayed involved. I followed her life. Through a school website. I knew she was safe. I knew you would call if something happened. I did call. The number stopped working. Kendra looked past me toward the elevators, as if the right exit might appear if she waited long enough. I am not asking to take her home, she said. I am asking you not to make the court say I left her. The honesty of it was almost worse than another lie. She had finally admitted that Sadie's home was not the thing she was fighting for. She was fighting the sentence a judge might write about her. You are not afraid of losing Sadie, I said. You are afraid of being accurately described. Her face hardened. You think those are different things because you already have what you want. What I want is for Sadie to stop believing one wrong word can take her family away. And what do you think happens if I go to prison? You think that helps her? Sadie did not take that money. She will still live with the consequences. Because you are placing them on her. Kendra stepped closer. You can end this. You can have the adoption after September. All I need is time. The offer was dangerous, because part of it was exactly what I wanted. If I agreed, Kendra might sign within months. Sadie could avoid more interviews, more court dates, and more supervised meetings with a woman she barely knew. I could trade one description of the past for a faster guarantee of the future. For a moment, I imagined telling Jonah to accept the delay. I imagined taking Sadie to a final hearing in the fall, signing the papers, and never having to place her life in front of another room of strangers. Then I thought about the cards. Sadie had spent 8 years changing words to protect adults. If I accepted Kendra's offer, I would be doing the same thing with a legal record. I would teach Sadie that her security could be purchased by pretending abandonment was temporary care. No, I said. Kendra stared at me. You haven't even discussed it with your lawyer. I don't need legal advice to know I will not lie about who raised her. I am offering you everything you filed for. You are offering it after the date you need. Her expression changed. The pleading vanished, leaving behind the older sister who had once learned that sounding certain was often enough to make everyone else doubt themselves. If you force this to a hearing, I will ask for reunification. I will ask the court to examine whether you turned Sadie against me. I will make them look at every conversation you had with her about why I was gone, then put every request in writing. You think your records make you untouchable? No. I think written requests make it harder to pretend you asked for something else. Jonah appeared at the end of the hallway. Kendra stepped away before he reached us. Are we ready to go back in? He asked. Yes, I said. He looked from me to Kendra but did not press for an explanation there. Inside the conference room, the officer asked whether the break had produced any movement. Kendra watched me across the table. There is no agreement, I said. I did not repeat her offer. I did not turn the hallway conversation into a performance. If it later mattered, I would tell Jonah privately. At that moment, the only decision the room needed was that I would not exchange the truth for a promise with an expiration date. Kendra's attorney formally requested a series of supervised parenting assessments. He said his client wanted an opportunity to demonstrate that contact could be safe and beneficial before the court decided whether her consent was still required. Jonah asked that every proposed contact be limited, documented, and approved in writing. He also requested that the existing legal custody order remain unchanged. The conference ended without settlement. Before we left the courthouse, I told Jonah exactly what Kendra had said in the hallway. He wrote down the date, the place, and the words I could remember without turning my account into more than it was. "This conversation will not decide the case by itself," he said, "but it explains why she wants the delay. Do not meet with her alone again. If she has another proposal, it goes through counsel and it goes in writing." When I picked Sadie up from school, she was waiting in the office instead of rehearsal. Her drama teacher had sent home the summer showcase script in a sealed folder, but Sadie had not opened it. "Did the meeting fix it?" she asked once we were in the car. "No." "Does that mean the adoption is not happening?" "It means I cannot promise when the court will decide." Sadie stared at the unopened script on her lap. "What if Kendra keeps saying no?" "I cannot control what she says." "What can you control?" "I can make sure no one trades you for an easier answer." She looked at me then. "Even if the easier answer gets you the adoption?" "Especially then." Sadie rested her head against the seat. She did not ask what I had refused, and I did not give her a burden she had no business carrying. 2 days later, Judge Brooks approved a limited series of supervised parenting assessments. They would not change my custody, and Kendra would receive no private access to Sadie. Miriam would observe whether my sister could do more than describe herself as a mother. When Jonah told me, I remembered Kendra's smile at the settlement conference. She believed the assessments had given her another stage. What she did not understand was that this time, no one would be judging how well she performed the title. They would be watching whether she could do the work. The first supervised parenting assessment took place at a family services center on the west side of Columbus. Unlike Miriam's office, the room was arranged to resemble a small apartment. It had a kitchen counter, a dining table, a couch, and a cabinet filled with board games and basic cooking supplies. A camera was mounted near the ceiling, and a family specialist sat behind a desk in the corner taking notes. Miriam explained that the purpose was not to measure whether Kendra and Sadie could enjoy an hour together. Anyone could prepare gifts, tell stories, or behave carefully for 60 minutes. The assessment was meant to show how Kendra handled the ordinary decisions that made up a child's life. Kendra arrived, carrying a paper bag from a bakery. She placed it on the table and announced that she had brought Sadie's favorite lunch from when she was little. She pulled out a strawberry almond pastry. Sadie looked at the pastry, then at me. She had developed a tree nut allergy at 6. An almond was listed in bold on the first page of the information packet Kendra had received. Kendra had remembered the strawberries Sadie loved as a toddler without checking whether the food was safe for the child sitting in front of her. She had also scheduled the assessment during the time Sadie normally ate a full lunch before afternoon rehearsal. "I don't really eat those anymore," Sadie said. Kendra smiled as though Sadie had made a joke. "You used to steal the strawberries off mine." "I also used to eat crayons." The specialist looked down at her notes. Kendra laughed, but her eyes tightened. "I brought other things," she said. "We can order whatever you want." Miriam asked Kendra to begin by reviewing the information packet she had received. It included Sadie's school schedule, allergy information, therapy appointments, and emergency contacts. Kendra skimmed the pages before saying she preferred not to treat time with her daughter like an administrative exercise. "Parenting includes administration," Miriam replied. "Today, we need to see how you use information that affects Sadie's safety." Kendra folded the packet closed. "I am capable of caring for my own child." The specialist asked what she would do if Sadie developed a fever during the night. Kendra said she would monitor her temperature, keep her comfortable, and call the doctor if necessary. "Which doctor?" the specialist asked. Kendra glanced at the packet. Sadie's pediatrician's name was printed on the first page. Kendra gave the name, but when asked where the office was located, she guessed the wrong suburb. When asked which medication Sadie could not take, she searched the packet again. "It begins with an A," Sadie said, trying to help. Miriam gently stopped her. "Your mother has the information in front of her. You do not need to answer for her." Sadie leaned back and crossed her arms. I recognized the expression. It was the one she wore when a teacher asked a question she knew but had been told not to answer. Kendra eventually found the allergy listed under medical information. She read it aloud, then looked at me. "You have had 8 years to memorize all of this," she said. "I have had a few weeks." "I didn't create the assessment," I replied. "No, you only created the conditions that made it necessary." The specialist redirected the conversation before it turned into an argument. She placed a blank weekly calendar on the table and asked Kendra to plan 5 school days if Sadie were living with her. Kendra began confidently. "School from 8 to 3. Homework afterward. Dinner at 6. Bedtime at 9. Sadie looked at the schedule. "What about rehearsal?" Kendra added rehearsal twice a week. "It's 3 times before a show. We can adjust. Therapy is Tuesday." Kendra moved rehearsal to Wednesday. "I also have rehearsal Wednesday." The calendar began to fill with corrections. Kendra did not know which days the school bus ran late, when the drama teacher required pickup, or how long it took to drive from the school to the therapist's office. She treated each detail as a small inconvenience, instead of part of the structure that kept Sadie secure. The specialist asked, who would collect Sadie if Kendra was unavailable? "I have friends," Kendra said. "Names and contact information? I would provide those if placement became realistic." "What if you were ordered to report somewhere unexpectedly?" Kendra's head lifted. "That is not relevant to my relationship with Sadie. It is relevant to a care plan." For the first time that day, her careful composure slipped. "I came here to show that my daughter and I still have a bond. I did not come here to be questioned as if I were applying for a job." Sadie stared at the calendar. "Tessa has 3 backup people." Kendra turned toward her. "I'm sure Aunt Tessa has arranged everything perfectly." The word aunt landed harder than it should have. Sadie's shoulders rose. Kendra seemed to notice and softened her voice. "I just mean she has had time. We will make our own system, Sadie Bug." Sadie pressed her lips together. "Please don't call me that. You loved that name. When I was 2. You are still the same person." "No, I'm not." The room went quiet. Sadie had said it without anger, but the truth of it filled the space between them. Kendra had returned prepared to reclaim the child she remembered. She had not prepared to meet the person that child had become. During a break, I took Sadie to the hallway for water. She stood beside the fountain and stared through the narrow window in the door. "Am I making her look bad?" she asked. "No. I keep correcting her. You are answering questions about your own life. What if the people writing notes think I don't want her?" "You are allowed to want answers without wanting to live with her." Sadie rubbed her palms against her jeans. "She acts like I'm supposed to remember being 2 better than I remember being 10. I told her she did not have to preserve Kendra's memories for her. When we returned, Kendra was speaking quietly with Miriam. She stopped as soon as Sadie entered. The second assessment happened without me in the room. Miriam had recommended that some sessions occur without my presence, so Sadie would not feel she had to watch my reactions. I waited in a separate area while a specialist observed Kendra, helped Sadie prepare a simple meal, and complete a homework task. I knew only what Sadie told me afterward, and what Miriam later summarized within the limits of her role. Kendra had read the recipe twice but ignored Sadie when she said one ingredient made her nauseated. During homework, she repeatedly corrected an answer that was already right because the method looked unfamiliar to her. Sadie described the afternoon while fastening her seatbelt. She kept saying, "Mom knows best," she said, but she didn't know the math. I asked how that made her feel. Like I was being rude for knowing my own homework. At the third assessment, Kendra brought up Patricia, the stepmother who had once forced both of us to call her mom. Miriam told me afterward that Kendra had accused me of repeating that harm by creating a household where Sadie was expected to replace her biological mother. When Miriam asked whether I had ever required Sadie to call me mom, Kendra said I had done something more effective. I had made myself indispensable. The accusation stayed with me because part of it touched an old fear. I had built every routine around Sadie. I knew her doctors, her teachers, her rehearsals, and the exact brand of crackers she could eat when anxiety made her stomach hurt. Kendra could point to that competence and call it control. But competence had not prevented Sadie from hiding 8 cards. If I had controlled her completely, she would not have spent years afraid to call me what she wanted. After the 3rd assessment, Miriam asked to speak with Sadie alone. I waited in the lobby, watching families move through the automatic doors. Some children ran toward the adults waiting for them. Others slowed as soon as they saw who had arrived. Sadie emerged 20 minutes later with red marks, where she had pressed her nails into her palms. She asked if we could skip rehearsal again. "You can," I said, "but the school needs to know whether you want to keep your role." "I don't know." "Then we tell them you need more time." She looked down at the floor. Kendra asked if I would like her to come watch me. "What did you say?" I said I didn't know if I was doing the show. Did she ask why? She said, "I shouldn't let anybody make me give up something I love." The words sounded reasonable until Sadie continued. Then she said, if I performed, we could take a picture together afterward. She said it would show everyone we were healing. I felt anger rise, but I kept my voice even. "You do not have to perform so anyone can prove anything." "I know. You also do not have to quit because someone used an old picture badly." "I know that too." She sounded exhausted by adults telling her what she did not have to do. That evening, I emailed the school and requested that no new images of Sadie be posted until she gave permission. I did not withdraw her from the showcase. I also did not push her back onto the stage. For once, I allowed a space to remain undecided, without filling it with my own fear. Miriam called 2 days later. She could not share every detail of her private conversation with Sadie, but she said there was one statement the court needed to understand. Sadie was not afraid Kendra would take her, because she missed her. She was afraid Kendra would use something she said to take me away. I closed my eyes. Miriam continued. The assessments are showing a consistent pattern. Kendra can describe motherhood. She can perform regret. What she has not demonstrated is a workable plan for Sadie's care. Will that be enough? That is not the question I will answer. I waited. My report will not decide who the real mother is, she said. It will address which adult is asking this child to carry the consequences of an adult's choices. Miriam's report was not yet final when Jonah received the date for the evidentiary hearing. Judge Brooks would first decide whether Kendra's consent was still legally required. The court would examine her contact with Sadie, her financial support, and whether any failure had been justified. Only after that could the adoption move toward the question of Sadie's best interests. Sadie would not attend this portion of the hearing. Miriam believed listening to adults debate whether her mother had abandoned her would force her to carry information she could not use and consequences she could not control. I told Sadie only that Jonah and I were returning to court to discuss records. "Am I one of the records?" she asked. "No." She studied my face before accepting the answer. "Good, because I have school." Her relief reminded me how easily adults could make a child believe her presence was required every time her future was discussed. The hearing began on a humid August morning. Jonah arranged several binders at our table, each marked with a year. The records inside were not dramatic. They contained school forms, medical authorizations, return notices, payment histories, and copies of the legal custody order Kendra had been required to follow. Across the aisle, Kendra whispered with her attorney. She wore navy and kept her hands folded over a yellow legal pad. Nothing in her posture suggested the woman who had cornered me in the hallway and offered to trade her consent for a delay. Judge Brooks entered and reminded everyone that the hearing was not a trial of Kendra's criminal conduct. The sentencing declaration mattered only if it helped the court evaluate the truthfulness of her claims about contact and support. She also clarified that the consent question centered on Kendra's conduct during the legally relevant period before the adoption petition was filed. Meetings created after Kendra was served could inform the court about Sadie's present interests, but they could not rewrite the years that came before them. Jonah began with the juvenile court order from 2018. It gave me legal custody and required Kendra to update her address, maintain approved contact, and contribute financially when able. The clerk authenticated the order. Jonah then moved through the notices sent to Kendra's last known addresses, and the envelopes returned unopened. There was no single moment that proved 8 years of absence. The proof was the repetition. A school form with only my name. A medical record listing me as the person who brought Sadie to every appointment. A yearly request for updated contact information that received no response. A payment history showing no regular support from Kendra. Her attorney objected whenever Jonah moved beyond what a document could establish. Judge Brooks sustained some objections and overruled others. The process was slower than anger, but it was also harder to rewrite. When Kendra took the stand, her attorney asked her to describe the years after Sadie's father died. Kendra spoke about depression, unstable housing, and shame. She said she had believed Sadie was safe with me and had feared that returning suddenly would cause more damage. "Did you intend to abandon your daughter?" her attorney asked. "No." "Did you stop loving her?" "Never." "Did Tessa welcome your involvement?" Kendra looked toward me. Tessa had already decided she was the better parent. The answer contained no specific conversation, date, or refusal, but it placed blame where Kendra needed it. Her attorney asked whether she had attempted contact. "I tried in ways that did not always leave formal records," she said. "I followed Sadie's life. I asked relatives about her. I checked the school's public updates." "Did you believe direct contact would be allowed?" "No." Tessa made me feel that I had no place. When Jonah stood for cross-examination, he did not ask whether Kendra loved Sadie. Love was not measurable, and Kendra could perform it more easily than responsibility. He placed the certified sentencing declaration in front of her. "You signed this document?" "Yes." "You affirmed that the information was accurate?" "To the best of my knowledge." Jonah directed her to the paragraph, stating that she had maintained regular contact and continued contributing to Sadie's well-being. "What contact were you referring to?" "I remained informed." "That was not my question. What regular contact did you maintain with Sadie?" Kendra shifted in the witness chair. "There were periods when communication was indirect. Name one person who regularly carried messages between you and Sadie." "I spoke to family members over the years." "Which family members?" Kendra named a cousin who lived in Kentucky. Jonah asked when that cousin had last seen Sadie. Kendra could not say. He showed her the response filed in the adoption case, where she had claimed I prevented her from contacting or supporting Sadie. "In this court, you say Tessa blocked all meaningful contact." "I said she made contact difficult." "In your sentencing declaration, you say you maintained regular contact. Which statement is accurate?" "They describe different aspects of the same situation." Jonah waited. Kendra continued. "I remained emotionally connected even when Tessa controlled physical access." "Did Sadie speak to you on the phone?" "Not consistently." "Did she receive letters from you?" "I did not know whether Tessa would give them to her." "Did you send any?" Kendra looked toward her attorney. "I cannot remember every attempt over 8 years." Jonah turned to the financial records. "Your sentencing declaration says you contributed whenever you were able. Identify one payment." "I bought things." "What things?" "Clothing. Gifts." "Were they delivered to Sadie?" "Some plans fell through." "Identify one item she received before you were served with the adoption petition." Kendra's mouth tightened. "I did not keep receipts for every act of motherhood." "No receipt has been requested. I am asking you to identify one act of support that reached the child." Her attorney objected to the phrasing, and Judge Brooks instructed Jonah to ask a narrower question. He did. Kendra still could not name one. The hearing continued through the afternoon. Jonah introduced the address Kendra had used in her criminal case, the same address where she had been successfully served. He compared it with the custody order requiring her to keep the court informed of any change. Kendra said she had been afraid updating her address would expose her to judgment and conflict. Judge Brooks asked, "Did any order prohibit you from filing your current address with the juvenile court?" "No." "Did any order prohibit you from requesting approved contact?" "No." "Did Tessa possess authority to prevent you from filing either request?" Kendra hesitated. Not legally. The distinction mattered. She had spent years describing my competence as a locked door, but she had never tested whether the legal door was actually closed. When it was my turn to testify, Kendra's attorney asked whether I wanted Sadie to call me her mother. The question carried more weight than its wording. "I want Sadie to use whatever name feels safe and honest to her," I said. "Would you agree that she considers you her mother?" "I agree that I have performed the daily responsibilities of raising her." "Do you want the court to hear Sadie say whom she prefers?" "No." His eyebrows lifted. "You do not want the court to hear her wishes?" "That is not what I said. Miriam can report Sadie's wishes in the way the court permits. I do not want her brought into this room to settle an adult dispute with a label. Her wishes matter. Making her responsible for our identities does not." Kendra stared at me as if I had refused a weapon she expected me to use. Judge Brooks then asked her attorney what practical outcome Kendra was requesting if the court continued to require her consent. He said his client wanted time to restore the mother-daughter relationship. The judge turned to Kendra. "Do you currently request that Sadie be placed in your home?" Kendra glanced at her attorney. "I am asking for the opportunity to rebuild." "That does not answer my question." "Not immediately." "Have you identified a bedroom for her?" "My housing is still being evaluated." "A school?" "She should remain where she is until we establish trust." "A physician, therapist, transportation plan, or alternate caregiver?" "Those details would follow." Judge Brooks asked how Kendra intended to care for Sadie if the criminal court imposed incarceration. Kendra's attorney objected that the outcome had not yet been determined. Judge Brooks allowed Kendra to answer only as it related to the feasibility of her requested plan. Kendra gripped the edge of the witness stand. "I am asking for time," she said. "For what specific plan?" "For my daughter to know that I did not abandon her. That is a desired conclusion, not a parenting plan." Kendra's control finally broke. "Once sentencing is over, none of this will matter." Silence settled over the courtroom before her attorney requested a recess. When we returned, he told Judge Brooks his client wished to narrow some of her requests. The judge did not mock him or complete the argument for him. "Counsel, identify precisely what relief your client is withdrawing and what relief she still claims serves Sadie's interests." He leaned toward Kendra. They whispered for nearly a minute. Kendra had asked the court to preserve her title, delay the adoption, and protect the record she needed elsewhere. Now that Judge Brooks required her to describe what she actually wanted for Sadie, every answer led back to September. She could not name a single request that remained about her daughter. Judge Brooks did not rule from the bench after Kendra's attorney failed to identify a request that served Sadie rather than the September sentencing date. She continued the hearing long enough for Miriam to complete her report and instructed both sides to submit any remaining evidence in writing. Sadie remained at school on the final hearing day. She knew Miriam had spoken with Judge Brooks privately about her wishes, but she did not know the details of Kendra's criminal filing. Before I left home that morning, she stood in the kitchen spreading peanut butter across toast with unnecessary concentration. "Does the judge already know what I said?" she asked. "Yes." "Did Miriam tell her the right way?" "What would the wrong way be?" Sadie put down the knife. "Like I hate Kendra and never want to know anything about her." "I didn't say that." "I know. I said I don't want to live with her." "I know that too." She looked at me until she seemed satisfied that I could hold both truths at once. "I want you to be my legal mother," she said. But I don't want everyone acting like Kendra never existed. You should not have to erase where you came from to know where you belong. Sadie picked up her toast. That sounded like something a judge would say. I'll try to be less formal at breakfast. She smiled, and for a moment, the hearing became what it should have been, all along. An adult responsibility taking place outside a child's school day. Miriam was already seated when Jonah and I entered the courtroom. Her report rested in a thin folder before her. Kendra sat across the aisle with her attorney. She did not look at me. Judge Brooks began by explaining that the court had two separate questions to resolve. First, whether Kendra's consent remained legally necessary after the period of failed contact and support. Second, if her consent was no longer required, whether the adoption would serve Sadie's best interests. The court will not substitute emotional labels for either legal analysis, she said. No child will be required to declare one adult real so another becomes false. Miriam took the stand and described her investigation. She had reviewed the custody order, school records, medical history, return notices, the supervised assessments, and both legal filings signed by Kendra. She had spoken with Sadie privately, more than once, and observed her with both adults. Kendra's attorney asked whether Sadie had expressed anger toward her biological mother. Yes, Miriam said. She has also expressed curiosity, concern, and grief. Those emotions can exist together. Does she want contact with Kendra? Sadie wants control over whether future contact occurs and under what conditions. She does not want immediate private contact or a change in residence. Does she refer to Tessa as her mother? Miriam glanced toward Judge Brooks before answering. Sadie's preferred name for Tessa is not the legal standard before this court. The attorney tried again. Would it be fair to say Tessa occupies the maternal role? It would be fair to say Tessa has performed the daily responsibilities of raising Sadie for 8 years. Miriam then summarized what Sadie had asked her to communicate. Sadie wanted the adoption. She wanted to remain in her school, continue therapy, and return to theater when she felt ready. She did not want Kendra erased from her history, but she also did not want Kendra's feelings, freedom, or legal problems made dependent on what she said. She understands more than the adults believe she does, Miriam said. She knows Kendra wants certain words from her. She does not understand every legal consequence, nor should she. What she understands is that adults keep presenting her language as something that can rescue or destroy them. My throat tightened. The 8 cards had begun in classrooms where children were expected to write a name at the top. Now the same burden had followed Sadie into court. Jonah asked Miriam what she had observed during the parenting assessments. Kendra can present warmth, she said. She can discuss regret and biological connection. What she has not demonstrated is a workable understanding of Sadie's present life, or a realistic plan to assume responsibility for it. She described the incomplete weekly schedule, Kendra's lack of knowledge about Sadie's medical care, and her inability to identify housing, school arrangements, transportation, or alternate caregivers. Kendra's attorney objected that his client had never been given physical custody, and therefore had no reason to finalize those details. Miriam answered before Jonah needed to. Kendra requested delay on the basis that preserving her legal role served Sadie. When asked what that preserved role would require in practice, she repeatedly returned to how the record described her. The attorney accused Miriam of interpreting Kendra's motives rather than reporting facts. I am reporting a pattern, Miriam said. Kendra asked Sadie to use specific titles. She requested photographs showing reconciliation. She emphasized statements that could be recorded while avoiding plans that would require daily caregiving. When Kendra returned to the stand, her attorney asked whether she accepted Miriam's conclusions. No, Kendra said. Miriam decided I was performing before she gave me a chance. Why do you believe that? Because Tessa has had 8 years to build a perfect file. I had a few months to prove I still matter. Her attorney asked whether she wanted to remove Sadie from my home. Not immediately. Do you want a relationship with her? Of course. What would happen if the court allowed the adoption? Kendra looked toward me before turning back to her attorney. Tessa would become the only mother the law recognizes. Everything I went through would be reduced to abandonment. Jonah stood for cross-examination. You just said the legal description concerns you. It concerns any mother. What specific benefit would Sadie receive if the court delayed the adoption? She would retain a connection to her biological mother. She has not asked this court to erase that connection, Jonah said. The assessments have already addressed what you can offer her now. I am asking why the delay must extend beyond the date you requested. Kendra's hands tightened in her lap. She needs time to heal. The declaration already admitted into evidence described reunification as active before these proceedings began. Your testimony established that the court-ordered contact began only after you were served. Your sentencing is next month. Is that timing the reason you need the adoption decision postponed? Kendra's attorney objected that the question called for legal speculation. Judge Brooks narrowed it. Ms. Calder, is your request for delay connected in any way to your pending sentencing? Kendra's composure held for several seconds. Then she turned toward the judge. If this court writes that I abandoned Sadie before sentencing, it will destroy everything. What does everything mean? Judge Brooks asked. My chance to stay out of prison. My chance to rebuild. My chance to be seen as more than the worst thing I have done. Is your request to delay the adoption intended to preserve that sentencing argument? Kendra's eyes filled, but her voice remained clear. I need the court not to decide this until after September. The admission did not sound dramatic. No one gasped. There was no sudden arrest or shouted confession. The truth entered the room in the same quiet tone Kendra had used, to tell Sadie, I was only her aunt. Judge Brooks asked whether Kendra intended to take physical responsibility for Sadie before September. No. Do you have a plan to take responsibility after September? I cannot know what will happen until I am sentenced. Then the delay you request would not create stability for Sadie. It would keep me from losing everything. Judge Brooks looked at her for a long moment. This court is responsible for Sadie's interests. It is not responsible for preserving an argument in another proceeding. The hearing ended without an immediate ruling. Judge Brooks said she would issue a written decision addressing consent first and best interest second. Until then, my legal custody remained in effect. With Sadie's permission, Miriam had copied only the fronts of the 2 cards that showed the conflict over names and attached them to her report. The 8 originals had remained sealed in a court envelope during the hearing. Outside the courtroom, a clerk returned that envelope to me. The cards had not proven abandonment. They had not exposed the criminal case or defeated Kendra's argument. They had shown what the argument was costing a child. I took the envelope home, but did not open it. I placed it on Sadie's desk and told her the originals were hers again. She touched the flap. Did the judge use them? She understood why they mattered. Did they make her choose? No. The court looked at what the adults did. Sadie nodded and slid the envelope into a drawer. For the first time since the original hearing, the cards were no longer waiting to be presented to someone. 4 days later, Jonah called while I was standing in the school parking lot. Sadie was inside, attending a rehearsal she had agreed only to watch. The written decision came through, he said. I gripped the phone with both hands. Judge Brooks had found that Kendra's consent was no longer required. She had also found that the adoption served Sadie's best interests. The case was not finished. There were still procedural steps before a final decree. But for the first time in 8 years, Kendra could no longer keep Sadie's future suspended by refusing to name what she had done. Kendra's sentencing took place in September. I did not attend. Part of me wanted to sit in the back of the courtroom and watch the story she had built collapse in front of another judge. That feeling lasted until I imagined explaining my presence to Sadie. I did not want her to believe that the woman raising her needed to witness her mother being punished in order to feel safe. Jonah told me we would rely only on public filings and information properly submitted by the attorneys involved. The probate court's written decision did not automatically travel into the criminal case. Kendra's adoption attorney received the ruling and informed her criminal counsel that the caregiver claim could no longer remain in the sentencing memorandum. Criminal counsel then filed an amended memorandum that identified the probate court ruling. Once that amendment appeared on the criminal docket, the prosecutor requested a certified copy of the decision through the clerk. The amended memorandum no longer described Kendra as Sadie's essential caregiver or claimed that incarceration would interrupt an active reunification. It said only that Kendra hoped to repair the relationship in the future. The correction prevented the false description from remaining unchallenged, but it could not erase the declaration Kendra had already signed. Jonah called me after the sentencing hearing ended. I was standing in the produce storage room at work, checking a delivery that had arrived with half the boxes mislabeled. The ordinary frustration of damaged lettuce and missing invoices made his call feel strangely distant from my life. The judge imposed a prison term within the plea agreement, he said. Kendra was also ordered to pay restitution based on the loss documented in the criminal case. I leaned against a metal shelf. Did the adoption case cause that? No. She was sentenced for the theft and fraud she admitted committing. The amount involved, the duration of the scheme, and the breach of trust were already significant. The false mitigation argument damaged her credibility, but the criminal court did not punish her for being a bad mother. I needed to hear the distinction. What happened to the declaration? The prosecutor asked that the issue be referred for review. That does not mean a separate charge will automatically follow. No one should call it perjury unless the proper authorities make that determination. So, she did not get home confinement. No. The argument that she needed to remain in the community as Sadie's caregiver was withdrawn and rejected as a basis for leniency. For months, Kendra had treated Sadie's life as a shield she could carry into another courtroom. In the end, the shield failed because it had never belonged to her. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt several emotions that did not fit neatly together. I was relieved that Kendra could no longer use Sadie to avoid consequences. I was angry that she had tried. I was grieving the sister I had once followed around our childhood home, long before every relationship became a story she could edit. None of those feelings made her sentence my victory. That evening, I told Sadie we needed to talk. She was at the kitchen table working on a science assignment about soil erosion. A tray of dirt, gravel, and small plastic cups covered the space where the 8 Mother's Day cards had once been spread. She noticed my expression and set down the cup she was holding. Is this about Kendra? Yes. Did she lose the other court? I sat across from her. The criminal judge sentenced her today. She will have to spend time in prison, and she has to repay the money she took. Sadie looked at the dirt on her fingertips. Because of what I said? No. Because of the cards? No. The criminal case began before the adoption hearing. Kendra admitted taking money from her employer. The sentence is a consequence of choices she made as an adult. But the judge found out she lied about me. The attorneys corrected what she said about being your caregiver. That mattered because courts need truthful information. It did not create the crime she had already admitted. Sadie was silent for a while. If I had called you aunt in court, would she have stayed out of prison? The question showed me how much of Kendra's burden had already reached her. No, I said. One word from you was never supposed to control another adult's sentence. Kendra wanted you to believe it had that power because she needed you to cooperate. Sadie rubbed dirt between her fingers. So, I couldn't have saved her. You were never responsible for saving her. Do I have to feel bad? You are allowed to feel whatever you feel. You can be sad, angry, relieved, confused, or all of those at once. She considered that. I think I feel bad that I don't feel as bad as I expected. I reached across the table, stopping before touching her hand. She turned her palm upward, and I placed mine over it. That does not make you cruel, I said. It means you are still learning what she is to you. Sadie nodded and returned to her project. A minute later, she asked whether prison had soil erosion. I told her I had no idea. The question sounded ridiculous, but it allowed us to leave the conversation without pretending everything had been resolved. The adoption still was not final. Judge Brooks had ruled that Kendra's consent was no longer required and that adoption served Sadie's best interests. But Jonah warned me not to treat the written decision as the final decree. Notices had to be completed, required periods had to pass, and the court had to schedule the final hearing. For once, the delay felt different. Kendra was no longer using it to keep Sadie suspended. The remaining time belonged to the process, not to my sister's strategy. Communication from Kendra was routed through her attorney and the channels approved by the court. She could not call Sadie directly or send messages through relatives. If she wrote, the communication would be reviewed before Sadie was asked whether she wanted to receive it. I did not promise Kendra future forgiveness on Sadie's behalf. I also did not promise Sadie that she would never have to think about Kendra again. I told both of them, through the proper channels, that any future relationship would move at Sadie's pace and could not be used to challenge her home. In October, Sadie returned to the theater room after school. At first, she only watched rehearsal from the back row. Her drama teacher agreed that no photographs would be taken or posted. The other students were told only that Sadie was deciding whether she wanted to participate. The first afternoon, she stayed 20 minutes. The second week, she helped another student remember a scene change. By the end of the month, she was reading lines for absent cast members, although she refused to call it rehearsing. "I'm just preventing artistic collapse," she told me. I did not correct her. The finalization hearing took place in November. The courtroom was smaller than the one where Kendra had pointed at me and demanded that Sadie call me her aunt. There were no competing attorneys, no exhibits, and no stack of gifts waiting to be opened. Miriam attended long enough to confirm that the adoption remained consistent with Sadie's best interests. Jonah stood beside us. Judge Brooks reviewed the final documents and asked whether Sadie understood that the adoption would make me her legal parent. Sadie said yes. The judge did not ask her to give a speech. She did not ask her to call me mom. She did not ask her to explain Kendra. Judge Brooks asked whether Sadie wanted to keep the surname Calder. "Yes," Sadie said. "It's already mine." No one treated the answer as rejection or loyalty. Keeping her name did not reduce my place in her life. It allowed Sadie to enter the adoption without being required to erase the child she had been before it. I signed the final documents. My hand trembled slightly when I reached the last page, not because I doubted the decision, but because I remembered every form I had once signed beside the words legal custodian. For 8 years, those words had been enough to get Sadie through school registrations, emergency rooms, and ordinary days. Now the paper recognized what our life had already required. After Judge Brooks signed the decree, Sadie asked whether we were finished. "We are," Jonah said. She looked at me. "Can we get lunch? Courtrooms make me hungry." There was no applause. No one cried on command. We left carrying one folder and the coats we had worn inside. Sadie and I sat in the car outside the courthouse. The decree rested unopened in the folder between us. She did not ask what the document said. She did not ask whether she was supposed to call me something different now. Instead, she looked out the window and asked, "Do you think the school will still let me have my spring roll?" I started the engine. "That decision belongs to you." The following week, I completed an updated school information form. I placed it beside Sadie's cereal bowl because she liked checking that adults spelled her middle name correctly. She read the first page and reached the section marked parent or guardian. Without ceremony, she wrote my name in the blank. Then she circled a spelling error in the emergency contact section and told me the office needed better quality control. I submitted the form without keeping a photograph of it. A few days later, the drama teacher confirmed that Sadie could ease into the spring production, attend rehearsals without committing, and decide later whether she wanted to perform. The school also agreed that no photographs would be used without her direct permission and mine. By late May 2027, Sadie was 11, and once again arguing with pieces of a costume 5 minutes before a performance. The spring production was a comedy about a group of children who accidentally replaced their town council with actors. Sadie played the youngest council member, a role that required a powdered wig, an oversized coat, and the confidence to interrupt adults who believed they were important. The wig had survived 6 weeks of rehearsal. On opening night, one of the elastic straps snapped while Sadie was pulling it over her hair. She held the broken piece between 2 fingers. "This is sabotage. It is old elastic," I said. That is exactly what a saboteur would want us to believe. We were standing in the narrow hallway behind the school auditorium. Students hurried past us carrying painted signs and cardboard furniture. Somewhere behind the curtain, a teacher called for a missing wooden gavel. Sadie looked at me as if I might be able to repair the wig, find the gavel, and reorganize the production before the lights came up. A year earlier, I would have taken over. I would have found the costume teacher, demanded stronger elastic, checked every pin, and followed Sadie backstage until someone told me parents were not allowed beyond the curtain. That night, I opened the emergency sewing kit I kept in my bag and handed it to her. "I can hold the wig while you thread the needle," I said. "You know I'm bad at knots. I can tie the knot after you decide where it goes." She studied the torn strap, then pushed the needle through the fabric herself. The first stitch was uneven. The second was better. When she finished, I tied the thread and trimmed the loose end. Sadie put the wig back on and shook her head hard enough to test it. "It looks crooked," she said. "It looked crooked before it broke." That was intentional character design. A student ran past us asking whether anyone had seen the missing gavel. Sadie opened her prop bag, reached beneath the folded coat, and pulled it out. "I thought this was mine," she said. The student grabbed it and disappeared toward the stage. Sadie watched him go. I have accidentally endangered the entire judicial system. Her jokes no longer sounded like a shield she was raising between herself and the adults around her. They sounded like what they had always been before Kendra returned, a way of making an ordinary problem more interesting. The school had asked for permission to photograph the production. This time, the form did not disappear into a folder with a dozen other signatures. Sadie and I sat down with the drama teacher and discussed exactly where the photographs would appear. The school could display group pictures in the hallway and send them to the families of the cast. Nothing would be posted publicly without Sadie seeing it first. Her name would not appear beside an individual photograph. The teacher asked whether those conditions made her comfortable. Sadie said, "I don't want to become a mysterious silhouette in every picture. I just want to know where my face is going." The decision belonged to her. She had not returned to the stage because I convinced her that quitting meant Kendra had won. She returned because the theater room still contained people she liked, work she was good at, and stories that did not ask her to testify about her own family. Before she went backstage, she adjusted the crooked wig and looked toward the auditorium doors. "Are you sitting in the usual place?" she asked. "Third row, aisle seat." "Good. I need someone to guard my jacket." She handed it to me and walked away before I could tell her she would need it after the show. I took my seat in the third row. Around me, families saved places with coats and programs. Parents waved when their children peeked through the curtain. Phones came out when the lights dimmed. Although the teacher had asked everyone not to use flash, there had been a time when I believed being present meant making sure Sadie saw me every moment. I would sit where she could find me and keep my expression steady enough to guide her through any forgotten line. That had been useful when she was 6 and dressed as a duck. At 11, she needed something different. She needed my presence to remain dependable even when she was not checking it. The curtain opened. Sadie entered during the second scene, with the missing gavel tucked under one arm and the powdered wig leaning slightly to the left. She delivered her first lines without looking into the audience. Her attention stayed on the other actors and the problem unfolding on stage. Near the middle of the play, The oldest council member asked Sadie's character why anyone should trust children to govern the town. Sadie was supposed to answer with a long sentence about adults, confusing age with wisdom. She began the line, reached the middle, and stopped. I saw the exact moment the words disappeared. Her eyes widened. One of the actors beside her waited for the cue that did not come. A year earlier, Sadie would have searched the rows until she found my face. She would have needed proof that forgetting one sentence had not changed who would be waiting afterward. This time, she stared at the actor challenging her and lifted the gavel. You should not trust us, she said. You should supervise us closely and bring snacks. The audience laughed. The other actor recovered and answered, That is the first honest campaign promise we have heard all week. The scene moved forward. Sadie did not look toward the third row. She did not need my expression to tell her that the mistake could be survived. She had already decided what to do with it. I watched the rest of the performance through tears. I refused to wipe away until the lights dimmed. The emotion was not pride alone. It was the recognition that Sadie had reclaimed something no court could award her. The stage belonged to her again. After the final bow, the cast gathered near the painted set for photographs. Sadie stood between two friends, still wearing the crooked wig. Before the teacher took the picture, she asked whether everyone was comfortable with it. Sadie checked the group, nodded, and smiled. There was no adult waiting outside the frame to turn the image into proof of a relationship that did not exist. The photograph recorded one thing only. A group of children had finished a play together. Sadie found me in the lobby 10 minutes later. She was carrying the wig in one hand and complaining before she reached me. Evan skipped half a page in the second act. My coat smelled like the storage closet, and this wig tried to leave my head during the final bow. You looked like a respected public official. I looked like a haunted pastry. Two of her friends called from the exit. Their families were going for ice cream, and Sadie had apparently been included in a plan no one had told me about. She turned toward me. Can I go with them? Yes. Send me the address. You know the place. I still want the address. She sighed with theatrical suffering, typed it into my phone, and ran back toward her friends. Our legal life had become ordinary enough that most days I did not think about the final decree. School forms carried my name. Doctors called me without asking for an old custody order. No one could use Kendra's refusal to keep Sadie's home uncertain. Kendra's letters, when they came, followed the channel approved for them. Sadie could read them, save them for later, or decline them. She was allowed to remember Kendra, ask questions about her, or keep her distance without fearing that any of those choices would weaken the family she had at home. The law had given us protection. It had not required Sadie to erase the first 2 years of her life, forgive 8 missing ones, or decide what Kendra would mean to her forever. Those decisions no longer had deadlines. I followed the families toward the exit and felt cold air move through the open lobby doors. Outside, Sadie had already joined her friends near the sidewalk. They were debating ice cream flavors and arguing over which actor had recovered best from a missed line. She did not scan the crowd for Kendra. She did not turn around to confirm that I was following. I looked down and realized I was still carrying the jacket Sadie had handed me before the show. I folded it over my arm and walked after her at the ordinary distance between a parent and a child who knew exactly where home was. For 8 years, Sadie had watched every room to see who would stay. That night, she ran ahead without looking back, because at last, staying was no longer something she had to prove.